lots of date and time calculations that you can make inside of Airtable as well. There are lots of formulas and functions that help you add dates to an existing date. You can use the now formula to get today's date. And we'll take a look at some common date formulas that we end up using in our work. Coming back into our tasks table, I want to create a new view dedicated to showing you the date and time formulas. The first one we're going to look at is created time and last modified time. These are field types inside of Airtable, but you can also use them as formulas. So here you can see the date these records were created and the time as well. You can also choose to use GMT or your local time zone. You also want to be cognizant of how you're naming your fields. I notice a discrepancy here, so I've named this created time, but right now my formula is actually only showing the date. So instead, I'll change this to created date. The last modified time is the same concept. You can create a new field called last modified time. And now you can see when you last updated a record. Generally speaking, if you've had any updates on the record, your last modified time is going to be later than your created time. Remember, these are helpful as formulas, but typically you'll be using them from the existing field types. I think that's a more efficient way of setting up your database, unless you're using a specific formula to achieve a different objective. The field types for created time and last modified time are far simpler to configure and set up. So for most scenarios, I would recommend that. You can also use the now and today to get the current time and date. We will often use today's date when pre-filling forms. For example, I might want to pre-fill a form later on for when I last logged a comment or when I last logged a time log. If the date field can be filled in using a pre-filled form, then that's one less thing for me to enter in manually. Next, we want to go through some date manipulation formulas. Some of the common ones are date add, date format, and date diff. Date add is a great concept to know because it lets you come up with a date based on some formulas and conditions. To set up this example, I'm going to create a start date for the task and a due date for the task. And these two are just static fields. Between the start date and the due date, I want to have an internal review date. Most likely, I'm going to base this on a certain period before the due date. I'm adding a new field called internal review date. In my formula, I'll start typing in date add. You're going to take the date time as the reference date you want as the first part of this formula. So for me, I'm going to take the due date as my reference date. After the comma, I want to say, well, 7 days, or rather 3 days before the due date, that's when I would like to have my internal review. And the final part of that formula lets you specify what is the time period you want to add or subtract based on. So for me, I want to subtract 3 days from the due date. One of the things you'll want to make sure is that all of your date fields in your database are consistent. Since I'm subtracting a few days from the due date, my internal review date is a few days beforehand. The next formula we'll cover is the date-time difference. This is a great formula to know because you might need to calculate the difference in between two different days. In our case, we can take a look at how many days someone has to do a particular task. So we can select the Datetime Difference Formula, and you can select from and to. So our from is going to be the start date, and our to is going to be the due date. The units, in this instance, I'm going to put days. If the time periods are really long for you, you could set those to months or weeks or years. So you can see that the number that came out is actually negative. It's a little bit strange, but this formula sometimes will require you to put the end date before the starting date. So I can also swap those around. The great thing about formulas is that you don't always have to remember precisely how a formula works because the formula itself will always give you feedback through the calculations. So in this case, I actually didn't remember whether the later date was supposed to happen first or the earlier date. So you can really rely on the formulas themselves to tell you what data you need and then adjust from there. The final date-related formula we want to cover is the datetime format. This is really helpful because it allows you to format dates in totally different ways. I'm just going to take the start date as an example here. I'm going to call this a formatted start date. And I'll select the datetime format formula. In this formatting field, you can either specify the precise format you want to see, or there are some Airtable shorthands that I'll show you in a moment. Sometimes you might need to format your days differently if you're exporting data from Airtable and sending it to an external source, or if you just maybe live in Europe and you need to see the month, day. I think Europe is day, month, year, and so is Australia, whereas North America is month, day, year. So depending on your preferences, you can change them however you like. Something that I also like to use is doing year, month, and date. This allows Airtable to sort your data really easily. And I forgot a closing bracket. So now we've got our formatted start date. One of the flaws when it comes to sorting inside of Airtable is that your January, if you use the month, day, year format, your January will happen first, and then it'll be October, and then November, and then February. So it doesn't sort dates as elegantly as we might expect sometimes. But if you change your date format to year, month, and day, then it will always sort properly. One of the things I'll sometimes look up is Airtable's date formats that it accepts. You can Google this and come to the supported format specifiers for the datetime format field. You can come to the support page for the different formats that are used inside of the datetime format formula. You can see there are lots of them down here. And one of the common ones I like to use is the uppercase L and lowercase l. I'll show you that in action back in our Airtable base. Instead of specifying year, month, and day, I can simply put a lowercase l. And that's going to show me the date in a month, day, year format. And if I use the uppercase L, the format will change slightly. So now the months have a 08 instead of just a number 8. You can take a look through the different date formats and see which ones you prefer. Thanks for investing in your own knowledge base. I'm Cherry Yang, the founder of Claribase. We're going to be releasing our flagship course, Airtable Mastery, for free. In the course, you can find over 100 videos on topics like design, integration, automations, and interfaces. It's perfect for the Airtable champion who wants to build their database right the first time. You can sign up for the course at the link down below.